Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our second session in our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion webinar series. This is a six-part series that we're doing throughout this month, September 17th to October 22nd. My name is Everall Eaton, and I'm the Membership Director at the Greater Wilkes-Barre Chamber. Just a few housekeeping items before I pass it over to our sponsor, PNC Bank, for a brief video and a few comments. All attendees will be in listen-only mode. To be respectful of everyone's time, we have a lot of time at the end for questions and answers. Feel free to put a question at any time during the presentation by submitting them in the Q&A section or the chat box. This event is also being live streamed on Facebook for anybody watching on Facebook. Please enter your question in the comments section and we'll make sure we get to those too. Recording of the session will be available on our Facebook and our YouTube pages by early next week. Anybody who registered for the event, we'll make sure that we send out a link to it so that you get it. Last, if anyone is interested in joining our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council or staying up to date on our efforts with the council, please visit the Get Involved tab on our website to find out more information. Let's get started with a brief video from PNC Bank, and then we'll hear from Matt Pugh at PNC, who will introduce our speaker for today.
Make today a new you had it in you day. Make today a we need a bigger trophy case day. Make today a learning the basics day. Make today a finally going in on season tickets day. No matter the day, PNC has the financial tools and technology to help. PNC Bank. Make today the day.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matthew Pugh from PNC Wealth Management. On behalf of everyone at PNC, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. At PNC, we embrace and promote diversity and inclusion as a core element of our values and culture. When the Chamber approached us late last year about getting involved in their inaugural Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Conference, we immediately signed on as a sponsor. When COVID sidelined the in-person event that was planned for April, Lindsay and Ben at the Chamber did an excellent job transitioning the commitment to ongoing conversation about greater inclusion and equal opportunities to this virtual webinar series. As recent events have illustrated, we all have a role and responsibility to create more opportunities for positive understanding and change. So thank you all for making the time today to prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is my pleasure to introduce Jennifer McClinton-Temple, who teaches writing and literature at King's College. Jennifer is the chair of the English department and specializes in professional writing and communication and Irish literature. During her 19 years teaching at King's, she has developed a special interest in mentoring young women and helping them navigate the issues they face in college and beyond. Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Matt. Just a little bit of background on how I became involved in this project. It has been a special interest of mine over the last, I would say 5 years, 10 years, thinking about how I can help my female students understand how the job market beyond college might look different from them than it does for their male colleagues. Now, that's not to say that it's not difficult for anyone starting a job, but for me, I'm 53 years old, and I've had a measure of career success. I'm also a very confident person, so it took me a long time to recognize that the challenges that face all women actually had an impact on me as well. I started to see subtle things and to realize that my gender was likely playing a role in how I was being judged, and my gender was also playing a role in the difficulties that I faced in terms of career success. Now, I'm an English professor. I'm not a business person. But a lot of the things I've learned along the way, I think, are applicable to a lot of different fields. So you've noticed, I'm sure, that I subtitled this presentation, Navigating the Uneven Playing Field. And that's the metaphor that I think works best when thinking about young women and their careers. The playing field is not even. It might look even, and businesses might strive to make it even, but there are a lot of factors that are still in place that make the playing field just rougher for women than it is for men. And that's what I'm going to start by discussing. So, first of all, is the playing field truly uneven? So just have a few statistics here. So 56% of all college graduates are women. That's a statistic from 2018, which is the most recent year available. So you can see that there are more women who graduate from college than there are men. In medical schools, the number of women enrolled is 50.5%. In law schools, it's 50.3%. It's a little bit less in MBA programs. 39% of students enrolled in MBA programs are women. So there, the balance does tip toward men. But my point with these statistics is that there are a lot of women, qualified, educated women in the pipelines of professional fields. So you would think that the representation of women in leadership roles would mirror these statistics, and they really, really don't. You might also say, well, let me advance to the next slide before I say that. Oops, let me go back. All right, so let's look at the statistics of women in leadership roles in this country. Now, I have a lot of different fields here, right? So the Fortune 500 companies, so the top 500 companies, which Forbes magazine does a list every year, female CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are at an all-time high, 37. That's not 37%, 37 out of 500. So it's 7.4%. College presidents, another place for leaders to land and to make a difference. Only 30% of college presidents in the United States are women. US senators, 26 are women. So that's 26% because there are 100 of them. Only 57 women in history have been US senators. State governors, 44 women in history have been governors of a state. 30 states, including Pennsylvania, have never had a female governor. To slide over to the arts, which is a field where I think we usually expect diversity and inclusion to be an important tenet and value across the board. Just to look at one category, the Best Director Oscar, only 5 women have been nominated for Best Director in the history of the Oscars, which goes back almost 100 years. And only 1 woman has won the Oscar for Best Director. I use Best Director because that's typically kind of the CEO of a movie set. And just in case you think, oh, well, those statistics about the number of women enrolled are, they're new. So maybe women haven't had a chance to catch up in the leadership positions. Unfortunately, that doesn't explain things, because the year that women surpassed men in terms of education was 1981. So since 1981, we have had more women earning all college degrees than men. Now, just to give you a little context on that, I graduated from college in 1989. I'm 53. So 9 years before I graduated, women were surpassing men in terms of education. So what happens between college, graduate school, professional school, and mid to late career success? What happens that you have this much higher percentage of women getting educations and showing ambition and talent and drive at that level, and then you have a dearth of leadership at the top of the scale later on? What happens? So we're going to talk a little bit about what happens. So, well, the first thing that happens, I guess, is kind of obvious. Sexism happens. So you can see that I've labeled this first bullet point, sexism and implicit bias. So let me talk about sexism first. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. And when the Civil Rights Act was passed, it made it illegal for employers to discriminate on the basis of sex, race, religion, ethnicity. And so prior to 1964, it actually was legal for someone to say, I'm not going to hire you because I'd rather have a man. That was legal. In 1964, that became illegal. But as everyone could probably guess, the biases that people might have in their hearts don't go away because a law is passed. And so rarely are you going to see that kind of open sexism occur today. You see it, but it's much harder to prove. It's much harder to bring out into the open. So, and this is a good thing, most companies in the United States, most colleges, most institutions have written policies against employment discrimination, against taking into account someone's gender or race or religion or ethnicity. Most companies have policies against doing that. And that's a good thing. But one of the things that's kind of taken over is this concept of implicit bias. So implicit bias is when you believe stereotypes or attitudes that affect your understanding of actions and decisions in an unconscious way. And implicit bias can affect anyone. It can affect men, it can affect women. So even when we might think, oh, I'm not sexist, I'm not going to act on any kind of sexist principles, we could still be doing that. I have two examples to explain how implicit bias can work. So the first example is called the Howard-Heidi study. So in this example, in 2003, at Columbia Business School, a professor did a case study where they gave half of their class a resume for a very successful Silicon Valley venture capitalist named Heidi Rosen. On paper, she looked fabulous. She had good education. She had achieved quite a bit. And so that resume was passed out. Half the class got Heidi's resume. The other class got the same resume, except the name on the resume was Howard Rosen, not Heidi Rosen. So the two resumes are exactly the same. The only difference is the name. And of course, these people aren't real. So it's very interesting what happened. In the case study, the students rated Howard and Heidi as being equally competent. But by a fairly large margin, Howard was rated more likable. They liked Howard better. And crucially, they would be much more likely to hire Howard for a position. So exactly the same. The only thing that's different is the perception that the person is a male or a female. This kind of study has been replicated in other places in very similar ways. It's also been applied to things like student evaluations in colleges. When people believe the person they're rating is a man, they tend to rate that person differently than when they believe the person they're rating is a woman. Another example that I'll give you does come from the arts field. Again, I think we expect, rightly or wrongly, we expect the arts to be more respectful of difference. But the example from the New York Philharmonic, which I actually read this week, was one of the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's favorite examples to explain implicit bias. The New York Philharmonic Orchestra, prior to 1970, had no women, literally no women. So in 1970, 0% of the orchestra were women. In 1970, they instituted a new audition policy. So from henceforward, people would audition behind a screen. So you're a trumpet player, you come in with your trumpet, you do your audition, but you're behind a screen, so the judges can't see you. They don't know if you're a man or a woman. The number of women who were selected for the orchestra immediately started to go up. And now, in 2020, 50% of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra are women, because they've been using this blind audition policy since 1970. So again, this is a case of implicit bias, because I'm sure that those judges prior to 1970 would have said, we don't care about the gender, but obviously it made a difference in terms of who was being selected. And in this field, it's a really telling example, because it doesn't matter how you look, it matters how you can play if you're a musician. So there should be no gender bias there. So that's implicit bias, and that creates an uneven playing field. The other major issue that I'm going to discuss today that creates an uneven playing field for women is parenting and caregiving issues. So that's going to be a section of the presentation too. So before I keep going, I just want to say, don't despair. You know, I know some of this stuff can make you think like, whoa, it's too hard. Starting a career is difficult for anyone of any gender. But it's tougher when the field you're walking on isn't even. But there are ways that you can deal with it. And I think that being aware of the problem goes a long way toward helping. I'm going to give some advice here on dealing with the likability problem. You know, I used that term when I was talking about Howard and Heidi. And the likability problem is a thing that many women face on the job. I'm going to talk about navigating stereotypes and cultural assumptions, including ones about motherhood. And I'm going to talk about finding a mentor. All right, so first, likability. So sometimes this is called the Goldilocks Trap. Everyone knows the story of Goldilocks and the three bears. And everyone knows that it kind of hinges on this Goldilocks wanted porridge that was not too hot and not too cold. She wanted a bed that was not too hard and not too soft. She wanted it to be just right. For women in business, but in lots of other fields as well, like education, like higher education, like in a college atmosphere, and that goes for faculty and staff alike, in politics, in medicine, for women in all these fields, the Goldilocks trap is real. So let me just explain how it works. Women are expected by society to be warm, sweet, agreeable. In general, that's what people expect from women. Leaders are expected to be decisive, assertive, and confident. And women in all fields often have to thread this needle. And it's a tough needle to thread. If you're too nice, you're going to be seen as not being potentially a leader. If you're not nice enough, you're going to be judged as unlikable. So let me give you two examples. These are hypothetical examples. They aren't real people. So imagine someone, let's imagine Michelle. Michelle contributes often in meetings. She's not shy. She speaks up. She says her mind. If she hears something in a meeting that she disagrees with, she respectfully speaks up. She makes it clear that she wants to be in leadership. She wants to move up in her job. She mentions that when it's appropriate. She mentions it in, evaluative sessions. She's clear that she wants to advance and she wants to take on leadership roles. Michelle is well thought of at work, but she just can't seem to get to the top. She just can't seem to be granted those promotions that would give her real decision-making power, which is what she really wants. And in her evaluations, she's often told that she, quote, rubs people the wrong way. She's too much. She's too direct. She's confrontational. On the other hand, we have Laura. Laura has a big smile. She's very warm. She's super inclusive. She always makes sure that every voice gets heard. She's also very competent and very hardworking. No one doubts her work ethic. No one doubts her brain. She also can't get to the top though, because what's said about her is that she's not tough enough. She's not assertive. She won't make decisions. She won't be able to handle confrontation. While it's certainly true that a man could fall into this trap, it's far more common for women. And in fact, it's the norm for women in a lot of fields that they will get stuck in this bind between too nice, not nice enough. Now, let me just, what do you do? So it's tough, I want to give you advice. I don't want you to feel despair. And there are things that you can do. I'm not saying they're easy, but there are things that you can do. Researchers tell us that the two qualities that most form the basis of our judgment of others are warmth and strength. You remember my two categories. Laura was warm and Michelle was strong. So both of those things are good things to be. So how do you navigate it? How do you thread the needle? Well, first of all, and I know that for many people, this is not going to be easy. Care less about what people think of you. You cannot control what other people think of you. Focus on what you can control. You can control how you behave. You can control how you act. Sometimes it doesn't matter if someone, quote unquote, likes you. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that you act unprofessional. It doesn't mean that you blow up. It doesn't mean that you can freely show your temper. That's not professional behavior. But it does mean that, and this is a struggle for many women, dropping this everyone needs to like me issue can be pretty freeing, especially when you think of it as focusing on what you can control. All right, the next bit of advice is something I'm going to come back to in a lot of different places. Always push for regular, specific, objective feedback. Now, here's what I mean by this. If someone says you rub people the wrong way, it's very fair to say, can you explain what you mean by that? Can you give me an example of a time when I reacted one way and I should have reacted another way? Pushing for regular, specific, objective feedback can help everyone here. It can help the supervisor be a better supervisor, and it can help young employees be better employees and understand how they come across and understand how they can work, like I said, control what you can control. Unfortunately, research shows that evaluations of women tend to focus on style in a way that evaluations of men don't. And what women do have under their control is asking for evaluations that don't focus on style, focus on outcomes. Typically, in a well-run organization, you will have goals. You will have stated goals. Are you meeting those goals? That should be the focus, not the style with which you're meeting them. Now, having said that, I don't mean to suggest, what if you're not a very inclusive leader when you're leading a meeting? What if you interrupt all the time? What if you belittle people? That's specific feedback. If a supervisor says, when this person mentioned a suggestion, your response was belittling. See how specific that is? So much better than belittle people in the wrong way. Together with supervisors, focus on outcomes, not on style. Ask, how can I do better? What am I not seeing? Focus on that specific feedback. So next, I want to talk about stereotypes and cultural assumptions. So one of the cultural assumptions and stereotypes that people often have of women, especially women who aspire to leadership positions. So women who are outspoken, women who are confident, and I count myself in this category, absolutely. I'm a very outspoken person. I'm very direct. I've never had a problem with public speaking. Women get too angry too easily. That's the stereotype. I've put the initials here, RBF. I think most women know what that stands for. Resting bitch face. I know a lot of women get accused of having this. It's not very nice. You especially will get accused of it as you get older and your face starts to change. I can't tell you how many times I've been told to smile by a stranger. Most women have that experience. Most men do not have that experience. Women are expected to be smiley. Women are expected not to show anger, not to show displeasure. There's not much you can do about that cultural assumption, but the way that you can push back against it a little bit, if you do get angry, if you are displeased, just focus on explaining why. Focus on explaining what's going on. Focus on talking. Another stereotype is that women are too emotional. Now, this has not been a problem for me in particular because I don't tend to cry when I'm angry or upset, but a lot of women do. Women go to great lengths not to cry at work for good reason. Crying makes everyone uncomfortable. But women are biologically wired to cry more easily. Women have more of the hormone prolactin than men do. It is actually easier for women to cry than men. And this might surprise you. Studies show that crying at work doesn't hurt women, but how they handle it is what matters. So if you do happen to lose the battle to not cry at work, acknowledge it. Collect yourself and move on. Take a few minutes, excuse yourself, go to the restroom, come back, acknowledge it, move on. Don't make a big deal of it. Don't apologize profusely. Just acknowledge it and move on. I also want to talk about some other types of stereotypes for women who are in the minority in terms of their ethnicity, in terms of their sexual orientation, in terms of their, if they are women who have a disability. It can be like a double bind because you get the intersection of both types of stereotypes. For example, African American women can be labeled angry or aggressive, even when they're not. Latinas are called fiery or overly emotional, even to the point of sort of irrational emotion, regardless of how they actually are. Asian American women are expected to act submissively. LGBTQ workers are often not out at work which creates an extra level of stress. And they're much more likely to be told to be more feminine or be more masculine. Disabled workers worry about when to disclose when their disability is not obvious, and whether the disability is invisible or visible. They are often assumed to be getting special privileges in a way that is unfair. So what do you do with all of those things? None of it sounds very good. So here's some advice on combating stereotypes and discriminatory behavior. Well, first of all, know the difference between a supervisor or a colleague simply harboring a stereotype but not acting on it, and actually acting on it. If it actually affects your work environment or affects the conditions of your employment, that's illegal. You should have an understanding of the difference between when behavior or thoughts crosses that line. There's not a one solid way to have a good understanding of it. My advice would be to ask other people, to read, to look at other cases, and especially if you feel that you are being discriminated against and if your work environment is being affected, to go to human resources. Now, I know that that's a piece of advice that you're going to get often, but it really is the place where you should begin if you feel that you are being discriminated against. Now, I've heard stories of people going to human resources with complaints of this nature and not being taken seriously. Unfortunately, that is the case sometimes, but I would say it's not the norm. Human resources departments, they're there to make sure that this kind of behavior isn't happening. So most human resources departments will take claims of discrimination or a hostile workplace very seriously. If you do find that you go to human resources and you're not given your due, my advice would be, again, to read around, do some internet research, and maybe to consult a lawyer. Not necessarily to hire a lawyer yet, but to consult a lawyer. Often you can do that if you have friends, if you know people. I know lawyers don't like for people to seek free advice, but typically a kind of, do I need a lawyer is usually an okay question to ask. And if you need to hire a lawyer, then that's what you need to do if you're being discriminated against. Next, keep a paper trail. Save emails, keep a journal, tell a trusted friend. All of these things matter later on down the line if the situation becomes too difficult. Saving the emails is so easy. Create a folder. If someone in a position of power is discriminating against you because of your gender or because of one of those other categories, start saving the emails. Start saving any kind of proof that you have down the line. Remember in the beginning of this, I said it's kind of hard to prove what's in someone's heart. So any type of paper trail that you can create is helpful. Now, I don't want to make it sound like I'm suggesting that everyone be litigious and that everyone be combative, because I'm absolutely not. Keeping a paper trail is something you can do, and if you don't ever need it, then you don't ever need it. It's something you can do on your own. The reason why I keep a journal is because if things happen and you write them down at the time, that can be really good evidence to look toward later. And the reason why you tell a trusted friend is the same reason, that you have that corroboration, and it can be really helpful. The next one is, I know, very hard, but it's important. Speak up politely but firmly when something bothers you. If you don't trust yourself to speak up in the moment, put it in writing later. I know sometimes it can be really hard, depending on people's personalities. It can be hard in a meeting to speak up, especially without having your voice shake, without seeming emotional, to speak up and say, I'd rather you not call me that. I've had male colleagues refer to me in ways in meetings that were demeaning, like with words that you might use to refer to your great aunt, like dear or sweetheart, things like that. That's not the way that you refer to professional people in work meetings. I've spoken up before, and it is uncomfortable. It is tough. It's not that hard for me to do because, like I said, public speaking doesn't really bother me, but there's no shame if it does. Just give yourself a day, put it in writing later. Let the person know. I didn't like that you referred to me this way, or I don't like that you use these terms around me. So next, I want to talk about the category of sexual harassment and discrimination. So first of all, I just want to differentiate between these two things. So sexual discrimination is when you are not getting a promotion or a job, when you're being held to higher standards, when there is a difference in pay structure, and that discrimination is based on your sex. That's illegal. It's illegal for companies to practice discrimination. Sexual harassment is a variety of sexual discrimination, and in certain circumstances, it is also illegal. Sexual harassment is unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or verbal or physical harassment that has a sexual nature. Unfortunately, I think it's true that most women will feel one or more of these situations at one time in their career. So what do you do? Well, first of all, read your company's policies. All but the smallest companies are going to have written policies on these types of behavior. It's a great idea when you start work for a place, or even before you've worked for a place, if you can get a hold of their policies, to understand what the policies encompass and what the procedures are. You can also read other companies' policies for comparison or reference. They're actually really easy to find on the internet, especially for large companies. Again, like with the other piece of advice, keep a paper trail. Anything that comes to you that makes you feel uncomfortable, keep a copy of it. Don't just, maybe your instinct tells you to brush it off at the time, that's fine. But keep a copy of something so that if your instinct changes or something else happens, you have that evidence down the road. And finally, speak up when something bothers you. And again, of course, with all of these pieces of advice, if you do feel that you're being harassed or discriminated against, you always want to take that to human resources. All right, so now I'm going to discuss this big category of parenting. So being a mother puts all those gender assumptions on full blast. So all the things we were talking about before with the warmth versus strength, parenting puts everything times 10. Many employers assume mothers, but not fathers, will be less dedicated to their jobs. They also assume that mothers, but not fathers, are less competent than non-mothers. This can have an even greater effect on someone's ability to advance than the stereotypes that we've already talked about. And just FYI, some of the people in my audience may be mothers already. Some of you may be thinking about becoming mothers later on, mothers or fathers, because our audience may be male and female, of course. The odds are really, really good that once a child enters the mix, the women are going to spend more time taking care of that child. It's just a fact of life. Right now, women spend 37% more of their time than men doing parenting work. So the odds are good that it's probably going to happen, that parenting is going to create more of a caregiving workload for women than it does for men. So what do? Well, first of all, I want you to know that having it all can be a really destructive goal. So thinking that you can work at the same level, nothing will change, you'll continue to work at the same level, or imagining that you can be super mom while working at that same level. Give yourself a break. Understand the places where you can scale back a bit. Let me advance to the next slide. And I'm going to actually skip down to the bottom here. Be clear about what would help. I have had several experiences in the course of my life in talking to women who are younger than I am, where all that was needed was a babysitter a couple of hours a week. And bringing in that babysitter for a couple of hours a week allowed that mother to free up her time just enough that she no longer felt like she was underwater. Now, let me backtrack a little and go up to the first bullet point again. So with parenting, know the laws. First of all, FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, when you do require maternity leave, unfortunately, there is no mandated paid maternity leave in the United States. The United States is one of only 5 countries in the world that does not have a mandated paid maternity leave. Let me repeat that again. One of 5 countries in the world that does not have a mandated paid maternity leave. The other countries, by the way, are Lesotho, Liberia, Papua New Guinea, and Swaziland. All countries that are far, far poorer and less developed than the United States. So it really is kind of shocking that we don't have paid maternity leave, but we don't. Now, many companies have paid maternity leave, and one state does a little bit better, California. Know what your institution's maternity leave policies are and read them for yourself. I have seen young women who on becoming mothers have had the maternity policy explained to them by a male supervisor incorrectly and taken less maternity leave than they were owed because they got bad information. Read the policies yourself. They're going to be in writing. Also, be aware that while we don't have paid maternity leave, do have unpaid mandatory leave. So if a company has 50 or more employees, they're required to give you at least 12 weeks of unpaid maternity leave. It's unpaid, but it is mandatory if you want it. Now, of course, a lot of women can't afford to take that. But first of all, know your rights. Next, think constructively about what you need. Sometimes it can be, just like I said, a little babysitting help here and there. But in terms of work, think about what you could ask for. Let me give you an example. When I was, shortly after I gave birth to my second child, I had 2 children, 2.5 years apart. So I had basically I had a 3-year-old and I had an infant. And I was breastfeeding my infant, and I was going back and forth to work. I live in Kingston. I work at King's College, which is in Wilkes-Barre. It's not a long distance, but I requested a handicap parking pass so that I could park, so I could come home, feed my baby, and go back to work, because I live so close that I was able to do that. The director of security at King's at the time told me no. But when my supervisor in the English department found out that I had been told no, he took it up to the director of security's supervisor. And he said, of course, that's something we will do. It was so easy. It's not a big deal for them, but it saved me 30 minutes every time I needed to do it, which was 5 days a week. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but it made big difference for me in terms of my work day. So think constructively about what you would need. I once read an article about a CEO, a female CEO, who was a single parent. She had young daughters. One of the things that she did was to make her day work more efficiently. Anytime she had any reading that she needed to do, she wouldn't do that at work. She would put that reading aside and she would do it after her children went to bed. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating that. You might want to just go to sleep after your children have gone to bed. But for her, it worked really well. She was being really intentional, really efficient about her workday. And then finally, the last prong I have here, ask for regular, objective feedback as often as you can. It's so important. So don't let someone just say, well, you're not as committed to your job after you became a mother. Say, can you give me some examples of that? Not to be defensive, but so you can get better. Next, I want to talk a little bit about appearance. I don't really I wish I didn't have to talk about appearance, but for women, it is an issue. It's an issue for men too, but it's a much bigger issue for women. How you dress, whether or not you wear makeup, is something that you have to think of as a young working woman. So my first piece of advice is to consider the culture around you. Look at how the other people on the job are dressed. Look at what the standard is. That doesn't mean that you can't put your own spin on it. It doesn't mean that you can't maybe go against that standard, but you certainly don't want to do that in the beginning because you don't know how important it will be. And you don't want to do it in ways that would be unnecessarily detrimental to you. It is really good. It's feeling good in what you're wearing can make you more confident. So it's important that you're comfortable in your clothes. But sometimes you might have to change your personal style just a little bit, especially in the beginning while you're seeing how things look. Standing out is fine, but not in ways that are a detriment to you or to your company. So I remember when I was going on the job market back in 2001, and another woman that was going on the job market at the same time as me, she kind of made a big deal about, I'm going to dress however I want. And I do remember that one of the things that she said to our female mentor, she said, I'm going to wear green nail polish. And Dr. Bennett said, no, don't. Makes you stand out in a way that is probably detrimental. Now, I think that probably sounds funny to you now, right? Because since 2001, green nail polish has become totally, totally normal. Lots of people wear green nail polish. The comparison I might make today would be like maybe graphic tees. You can imagine a casual workplace where someone could wear like a graphic tee underneath a blazer and look really cool. But maybe that's too casual for the workplace, or maybe you don't want to, maybe whatever the graphic is has the potential to make you look a way that you don't want to look. One tip is to consider a capsule wardrobe. So this is like about 30 pieces that all go together, which takes the guesswork out of it, makes it easier to decide what to wear in the morning. And then finally, consider buying secondhand. When I say consider a capsule wardrobe, I know that for a lot of people, you can't just go out and buy 30 pieces of clothing. But if you supplement with secondhand stuff, you can afford to do that sort of thing. And there's a lot of good clothing available at thrift stores. Finally, I'm going to give you the most important piece of advice that I have. Find a mentor. Any book that you read about women in leadership will tell you that this is the most important thing that you can do. Additionally, when we did, I did a webinar with two African-American women and one woman on the autism spectrum. I did the webinar for PA CareerLink back in May. And that was the most important piece of advice coming from these seasoned career women. find a mentor, find someone to help you navigate the landscape. Now, you want to avoid, will you be my mentor? It's kind of awkward. Instead, don't think about get a mentor so you can excel. Excel and you will get a mentor. Once you start at a new place, look around you and see which people stand out as people who are doing the things that you want to do. Work to show those people who you are, and the odds are good that an organic mentor relationship will develop. And also, don't discount men as potential mentors. I do think for most young women, a female mentor would probably be more useful, but the professor I counted on most at King's when I started in 2001 was a man, and his guidance in my career was invaluable. That's easier said than done. Some men don't want to be seen alone with young women. So the advice there is, don't go to dinner, don't go to drinks, go for breakfast, go for lunch. Those are lower stakes times of the day, times when you can get to know someone personally. Be open to formal programs. Some companies have formal mentor programs that helps you avoid the will you be my mentor awkwardness. And finally, be open to feedback. If your mentor gives you feedback, don't be defensive about it. It can be really hard to accept constructive criticism, but it's almost always in your best interest to do that. All right, so I've come to the end of my presentation and we have a little bit of time here. So I think that Ben was going to kind of moderate the question period.
Yes, we already have 2 questions. And anybody feel free to put them in the question and answer or the chat box, or if you're on Facebook, leave a comment and we have that open. We'll make sure we address that. The first question that we have is from Amy. And she put, when considering the number of women winning Oscars for Best Director or the number of female governors, was the population considered? For example, how many females versus males run for governor, or how many actual female movie directors are there?
Well, certainly fewer. In both cases, there are fewer. But on those, I didn't give percentages. I just gave totals. So I wouldn't be able to give you off the top of my head what the percentage versus the actual number is. So I guess the answer is no, the percentages weren't considered. I would say we should also be able to give you off the top of my head what the percentage versus I'm hearing the recording. I would say we need to ask why there are fewer women running for governor and why there are fewer female directors. Those are important questions.
Awesome. And then from Megan, how would you go about creating a mentoring environment for new female coworkers who are brand new to your industry?
So if I'm thinking of my industry, which is higher education, one thing that I am in the process of developing at King's is a women's caucus. So this would not be a formal group, but more of an informal group where women, both faculty and staff, can get together and talk about issues that are important to them. I think that it's developing a mentor relationship needs to be organic. It won't work as well if it's forced, like, will you be my mentor? So if you start with that kind of informal network, you can find those connections that will help provide that support for women at the beginning of their careers, ideally to come from women who are mid to late career. So I would say start with some kind of informal group because it really lowers the stakes.
And then we got another one from Diane. How do you navigate internalized misogyny from women in the workplace?
Well, that's a really good question, and a lot of the stuff that I was talking about in terms of implicit bias, it's no different when the respondents are women versus when the respondents are men. In the Howard Heidi study, the women in the study were just as likely to rate Heidi less likable as the men in the study were. So the implicit bias is equally true of women in judging each other. So it definitely is a problem. But honestly, my advice doesn't change. Ask for objective, specific feedback. Push to be judged as fairly as possible on the measures that usually will be written down. Here's my evaluation, and show me how I am meeting or not meeting these markers. I know it's frustrating, and I know it's hard not to get angry, but it's in your best interest to keep trying to push down to objective, specific, clear feedback from women and from men.
Okay. Anybody else have any other questions? I have one question. I know there's going to be some men that are watching this, and especially some of the stuff that you talked about, I think sometimes they don't realize that that does happen to women. And sometimes when those blinders come off, that's hard to see and even harder for the women that experience it. But how can men be better advocates for their female peers in the workforce?
That is such a good question. And you are right when you say that most men don't see it. Mm-hmm. The first thing I would say in terms of advice for men is listen to your female peers. Listen to your female peers. So if your female coworkers are saying that they feel that they are experiencing a hostile work environment, listen to them instead of discounting it because you don't see it, because the odds are good that you wouldn't see it. So my first bit of advice is listen. My second bit of advice is, once your eyes have been opened, stand up for your female colleagues. What an effect it would have in a meeting if another man said, hey, I notice that you keep interrupting Mary, but you never interrupt Jim. That's going to have such a bigger effect. And by the way, studies show that women get interrupted far more often than men do in meetings. It's going to have such a big effect if a fellow man says, hey, this is something I noticed. So those are my two pieces of advice. Listen, and then once you see it, speak up.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer. This was a great presentation. One of the questions we had last week was, could you share the slideshow? Is that something we could do to participants?
Oh, absolutely. Sure.
Awesome. So we'll make sure anybody who registered that we get the slideshow and the recording out to you. If you want the slideshow and you're watching this post-recording, you can send an email to ben.eaton, E-A-T-O-N, at wilkes-bear.org, and we'll get that over to you. But thank you again, Jennifer, for presenting this. It was a great session. Thank you, PNC, for being the sponsor again. And if you're interested in next week's topic, Jennifer brought up the topic of implicit bias. Next week, that is the topic of the week. So we'll be spending an hour talking about implicit bias. That's Arthur Breeze from Geisinger who will be presenting that one. So I hope everybody could join us next week, and thank you all again.
Great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.